Here's my audience.
Wow.
Okay. Most people think that domestic violence will never happen to them, that domestic violence only happens to poor black women in poor neighborhoods. This is extremely inaccurate. Domestic violence can happen to anyone in any relationship. There are many kinds of domestic violence, not just physical violence. I started volunteering at the Willow Domestic Violence Center about a year ago. I have learned so much about domestic violence I never knew happened to people. I have learned about domestic violence by reading survivors' stories, and worst of all, I've heard them talk about what has happened to them. Domestic violence is a big issue, but few people understand how prevalent it is. I think it's important to know about domestic violence and why it's such a big problem in our society. There are many kinds of domestic violence. It could be either mental and physiological, which means the abuser is jealous of the person and isolates them from society. It can be emotional or verbal, which is making them feel bad about themselves. And then physical, which is actually hitting them or threatening to hit them. Sexual, which is forcing them to do sexual acts. Economic, which is forcing them or preventing them from having a job or a source of income so that they won't be able to leave. Or spiritual, which is isolating them from their faith community and using religion as an excuse for violence. There are some control wheels that explain the cycle of violence, and the first one is the power and control wheel, which explains just the different types of violence that there are and like different threats and intimidations that people use. And there's also a cycle of violence, which kind of explains what the cycle is. And in an abusive relationship, it has the honeymoon phase, which is when everything's okay, and then the tension phase when you know that there's going to be an act of violence coming, and then the violence which actually happens. And then right after the violence, the abuser usually goes straight to the honeymoon phase so that you won't leave and you'll end up forgiving them. Let me tell you some facts about domestic violence that people don't normally know. Most domestic violence cases are never reported. Most people don't ever call the police because they don't want any legal issues. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in her lifetime. Women ages 20 to 24 are at the greatest risk for domestic violence. And domestic violence happens to men as well, even though the numbers aren't as high as women. There are also a lot of myths about domestic violence that aren't true. Myth number 1 is that domestic violence only occurs in poor neighborhoods, but that actually isn't true. It happens to all different kinds of people, and it happens more in families that are average because nobody would suspect it. Myth number 2 is that abusers suffer from low self-esteem, and so they abuse people to make themselves feel better, but that's actually not true. Abusers have a really high self-esteem, and they do it just so that they have control over somebody. And myth number 3 is that alcohol causes domestic violence. And although there is a high correlation between alcohol and abuse, it's not the actual reason. There's no causation from alcohol to abuse. A lot of abusers just use that as an excuse when they get violent, is they just say that, oh, I was drunk. When people hear about domestic violence, most people ask why women stay in their relationship. But there are many barriers that women have to face when trying to leave an abusive relationship. Some of the barriers are she might not know places to go to help her get away from her abuser. She may be afraid that her partner will beat her or even kill her after she leaves the relationship. And most deaths about domestic violence occur in the first 3 months that a woman left the relationship, so when they're not dating anymore. And she may be dependent on her partner's income, which has to do with economic barriers. If she doesn't have a job, then she can't just leave the relationship because she has nowhere to go and nowhere to buy any food. And also a huge barrier is a lot of people have kids, and so they don't want to have to fight for custody for their kids in courts or pay for it. All in all, domestic violence is not easy to solve, and it's a constant cycle that our society has to deal with. And women are strong and need to keep empowering themselves and a good relationship is a healthy relationship.
And here's my audience again.
Agree.
I don't know if these are in the thing. Okay.